Hello, everybody, and welcome to a very special episode of JTV, where we are joined by a regular of the show who has been so popular. And I've seen in the comments in every video that I do with her, people saying, more, please, more with Trudy, please get her back on. And so I'm thrilled to be joined by historian Trudy Gold, who is also a very close friend. Trudy, thank you so much for joining us today. And we're talking today about a less thrilling subject, but nonetheless important. The story of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. If you're not familiar with that name, you should be, if you want to understand anti-Semitism and how it's developed and how it manifests and what is some of the fuel of the fire to this long-term hatred. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a fabricated text purporting to detail a Jewish plot for global domination. And it was first published in Imperial Russia in 1903. And since then, it has fanned the flames of Jew hate in a way that you might not be fully aware, whether it's from the Nazis to European anti-Semitism to the Arab world to modern day anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, this is more relevant than ever. And so it's so important that we understand its story and its history. Trudy, the last time I have to say, a point of slight, a lighter note to start with. Today, of course, we're seeing the results of the UK election, and we did a previous interview on George Galloway, didn't we? And talking about his history, and it looks like he's lost his seat. So at least that's a little bit of lighter and happier news to start off with, isn't it?
Let's hope things will ease up a bit. We have to have hope.
Yeah. So Trudy, let's go right into this this dark topic. Tell us about the origins and how did this all get going? Because people know it exists, but how did it start?
Well, it all begins, as you said, in Tsarist Russia. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about its impact. Norman Cohn, who wrote a brilliant book in 1967 about the protocols, he actually called it the warrant for genocide. And some historians go as far as to say it is one of the planks that led to the Shoah. Certainly Hitler talks about it a lot in Mein Kampf. Not only that, even in the war, when he was murdering Jews, they set up a little division to find out where the headquarters of the elders were, and they decided it must be in New York. Look, it is a complete fabrication, and it purports to tell the story of a group of Jews who come together to talk about global domination. It's been translated into 120 languages. Today, it's widely taught throughout the Arab world. It's a staple of Russian Orthodoxy. It's the staple of the far left, the far right, Israel conspiracy theorists, evangelicals, neo-Nazis, the extremists. You see, it's a very neat little theory. In a world of political, social, and any kind of instability, people tend to look for irrational answers. And you've got this wonderful little irrational answer. You know, there are 14 million Jews in the world. When the Chinese measure their population, their margin of error is 14 million. And one of the issues that's always absolutely fascinated me, why are we so important in history? This isn't the purpose of this chat, and I think many of you will have thought about it a lot. I think it goes back to the centrality of Judaism to both Christianity and Islam, but that's very much another story. Going back to the protocols, if you think about today, I've mentioned where it spreads. Think about the COVID crisis. Think about all the insecurities of the world. What if we have this neat little theory that in fact there's a sinister group of elders who are pulling the strings of the world? Of course, it's a total fabrication, but it's also tied up with this ridiculous notion of Jews and power. The reality, if you want the greatest example of powerlessness in history, I would say it was the Shoah. When a third of all Jews were murdered, when the rest of the world stood by and in the main just let it happen. Now that is real powerlessness. But nevertheless, and we have to ask ourselves a very serious question, where on earth does this notion of power come from? And I think tragically, it's tied up with religion. Because for centuries, the Christian church pushed against the Jew the notion that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, therefore the deicide. So you've already got this kind of feeling. And can I just mention to you that for centuries, Jews were the pariahs of Europe. They were outlawed, more or less, in the Christian world, but they were economically useful. They were disbarred from the majority of professions. They become the moneylenders, the merchants of Europe, but they are outside the system. It's only the European Enlightenment which plunged them into modernity. And what happens in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century, this people, which have a long tradition of learning, these outsiders looked at the modern world and they were acting as individuals, and they became important in many movements for change. For example, you see quite a few important Jews in the world of capitalism. You see important Jews in the world of communism. They have absolutely nothing in common with each other. But nevertheless, if you're looking for a conspiracy, Marx is a Jew, Rothschild is a Jew, so consequently, they're working together. The tragedy of the European Jews was that it had given in to what we call the Emancipation Contract. It was all started by Napoleon. The Jews of France, only 40,000 of them, had been emancipated by the French Revolution. And basically, after the revolution, Napoleon wanted to find out where the Jews fitted into French society. His envoy said everything. To the Jews as individuals, everything. Israel as a nation, nothing. Give up your notion of nationhood. And this is what European Jews did. They were British, they were French, they were Italian, etc., acting as individuals. However, what happens is in the terrible tumult, which is the 19th century, where so many people were struggling to find their way. I had a brilliant tutor. She said to me, use your historic imagination. If you were born in 1800 and you died in 1900, think how much you would have seen in your lifetime. Now, so many thousands, millions of people suffered as a result of change. It's a question you have to ask yourself. Do people like uncertainty? Do they like change? And I think the answer is not. So what you see growing up in 19th century Europe, amidst the collapse of empires, the growth of nationalism, is that this people who are becoming visibly prominent, are they really German? Are they really French? Are they really British? And a new word is coined, antisemitism, which is not hatred of Jews for theological reasons, it's hatred of the Jewish race. Now, we could spend hours talking about the whole notion of race, which I think the majority of people think is totally spurious. To create a pure race, you'd probably have to geographically isolate people for thousands of years. So it's a spurious notion. But the point is, in the 19th, early 20th centuries, amidst all those insecurities, people become tribal. So how does it affect the Jews? There's already anti-Semitism in Europe, and I need to switch now to the Russian Empire, the dying decades of the Russian Empire. And this is where this fabrication first appears. All scholars agree with this, that it appears in the dying embers of the Tsarist Empire. In the reign of Nicholas II, the last of the Tsars, where Russia was Russia was falling apart. There was huge poverty, and you have an autocrat trying to cling on to power. Now, and people needed a scapegoat. And according to another very good historian, Hadassah Benito, who is herself an Israeli judge, she's written a book about the protocols from a Jewish point of view, because there's going to be trials of the protocols. They first appeared at the home of Grand Duke Sergei and his wife Elizabeth. He was the uncle of Nicholas II. He was a violent anti-Semite. He, in fact, had been responsible for the expulsion of the Jews of Moscow with 24 hours notice, a tragic, tragic situation. His wife had helped appoint a woman called Eliana Ozavarova to be lady-in-waiting to the Empress Alexandra. They're very close to the imperial family. And Eleanor's uncle had actually presented to the prince a manuscript entitled The Subjugation to the World of the Jews, talking about a Judaic Masonic conspiracy. And he explained that there were in fact 24 protocols. And I'll talk about that fabrication later on. The ancient and modern protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, there was a relatively liberal minister in Russia called Witt. He was trying to stabilize Russia, and he was alarmed by the document. He realized it was a total forgery, and he believed it was being promulgated by reactionary forces within the Russian secret police by a man called Rakotsky. It also ties up with Rakotsky was working in Paris. Now think about what's happening in Paris in the last decades of the 19th century. It's the Dreyfus affair. France itself was incredibly unstable. And in the story of the Dreyfus affair, where Dreyfus, the only Jew on the general staff, is accused of treason, the problem with the Dreyfus affair wasn't that the people were screaming death to Dreyfus, they were screaming death to the Jews. In the end, the man is innocent, he's finally pardoned, but there was a huge anti-Semitic furore in France, which Rakotsky fanned. He actually fanned it through this notion. And then you need to switch to Kishinev. Kishinev was the capital of Bessarabia within the Russian Empire. There was a paper called the Bessarabiets, edited by a man called Khrushchevan. In fact, later on, Lenin, when he took control of Russia, when he wanted to talk about reactionaries, he called them Khrushchevans. Now, Khrushchevan, in his newspaper in 1903, began to publish versions of the protocols, this Jewish world conspiracy. It was also tied up with blood libel and all the old archaic horror stories against the Jews. It led to pogrom, the appalling Kishinev pogrom. In addition, there is a man called Sergei Nilis. Now remember, these are newspaper articles, these are pamphlets. He was a monk. He was also at the very strange court of the Tsars towards the dying years of the Tsarist Empire. Don't forget Rasputin. Don't forget, you know, when an empire is dying, it's not just an empire that's dying, it's any kind of spiritual enlightenment that's dying, any kind of moral imperative is dying. And people were involved in all sorts of seances, rituals, all these kind of crazy things. And this guy, Nilis, he also writes a pamphlet which becomes a book on the protocols of the elders. So gradually, in these different directions, these books become part of Russia. Now, later on, they were analyzed, and we know where it really does come from. There was a man called Hermann Goethe who took the pseudonym Sir John Ratcliffe, and he worked for the Russian secret police. He worked in the postal service, and he forged letters from democratic leaders. He was violently anti-Semitic, and he wrote a book called Biarritz, which had a chapter in it called In the Jewish Cemetery in Prague. He talks about a nocturnal meeting of 13 Jews who represent the 12 tribes of Israel and Jews in exile. Now, as you well know, 10 of the tribes are lost. So, but nevertheless, it's in Prague. Tie that up with the notion in Judaism of the Golem in Prague, the Maharal of Prague, a very sort of spiritual place. And he twists this all up. And this pamphlet appears first in Paris, then in Prague, then it goes to Russia. This was written in 1872. And later on, scholars who needed to actually work out where the protocols came from, and this came up in trials, in court cases, they think that much of it came from this novel, from Biarritz. And it also, funnily enough, came from a novel. A man called Maurice Joly, who was a French political writer. He satirized the reign of Napoleon III. He wrote something called The Dialogue in Hell Between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. He's making fun of Napoleon III. It's a political satire. But many of the ideas which are later transferred to the Jews in the protocols comes from him. He was actually put in prison because the book was banned. So all these ideas come together. You know, when Alexandra was taken away at Ekaterinburg, there was a copy of the protocols on her bedside. It spreads like wildfire. So that's basically the origins of the protocols.
And Trudy, can I ask, what was the motivation, would you say, if you had to pin it down, what was the motivation in creating this document?
Looking for a scapegoat. Look, the Russian Empire is falling apart. There are revolution is in the wind. In 1905, you had the revolution. Look at what's happening in the world today. Think about the COVID crisis. Think of some of the responses to COVID. What was it? Conspiracy theories. The Jews were the perfect scapegoat. They still are.
But I'm asking for the Russian Empire. Okay, you scapegoat the Jews. Now what?
Well, it led to the formation of the Black Hundreds, the mob going through the Pale, screaming death to the Jews. Let's turn the people away from the real horror of Russia, and let's give them another thing to hate. Let them hate the Jews, the old traditional enemies. So it's basically, it's a tactic.
And these people that you mentioned that created it, do you think they knew? Did they know full well this is a total forgery? They're being cynical, or do you think they may have believed actually?
No, they wrote it. They made a fabrication. They fabricated a story.
But what I'm saying is,
it emerges as
they believed any of it.
When Nilis went mad, he actually was committed. Khrushchevan was a very, very cynical, evil character. Look, it's a lovely story. And the way and there's lots of different versions, but this notion that the Jews meet in a graveyard in Prague and the devil appears and they sit down and they talk about how they're taking over the world. Would you like me to read you some of the protocols?
Please.
Let me find them for you.
Yeah. Trudy, what do you think? Should we go to the next meeting in Prague?
I've been many times, darling. You know something? Nobody listened. Now, where did I? Hold on. Let me get the protocols. I've got too many pieces of paper, darling. The protocols. Now, there was another interesting forgery. Let me find it. Hold on a minute. The protocols, by the way, they were also used in support of this. For example, in 1911, there was a terrible blood libel case in Russia, Mendel Baylis, and they were used in support for that. Okay, let me. So who came up with the idea? I've given you three possibilities, and it's a blend of all of them. You have different people looking for a real conspiracy theory. It's like a benign conspiracy theory was that Marilyn Monroe was murdered by the Kennedys. Well, it's not benign, but it's about one event. Or Elvis is alive, or he's living on Mars, or the Freemasons control the world and the Jews control the world. I was actually in Cornwall in a bread shop, would you believe it? And I was buying bread and it was quite expensive. And I said to the guy, the prices have gone up. And he said, oh, yes, because the Rothschilds are manipulating the markets. And I looked at him and I thought, am I going to let that go? And I didn't.
Good.
Next time he saw me coming along the street, I saw him like cower behind the counter. But but I think it's because people are not rational. You see, everything we do is not rational. That's the dream of the Enlightenment, that we would be able to use reason. The protocols is an irrational document. So let me find the protocols, because the protocols, they're posited to an elder. They're talking about how they're taking over the world and how well they're doing and what are the weapons they're using. For example, alcoholism. Let's get the people drunk. That's how we control. We will propagate ideas to corrupt them, like Darwinism, Marxism, liberalism, socialism, anarchism, utopianism. We will use all these ideas at our disposal to corrupt the masses. We control the world. We will have a world government. We will also instigate world wars. We will stage catastrophes and then claim the moral high ground. This is very different. This is a very dangerous one. We will stage catastrophes against our own people, then claiming a moral high ground and therefore leverage. And the obscene issue today, you even have these conspiracy theories, and I can't even bear to talk about it, that they say the Zionists were in cahoots with the Nazis because they thought out of Israel. If Israel was created, that out of this horror story, people will feel sorry and create Israel, which is one of the most obscene libels today.
And that was Mahmoud Abbas's PhD, wasn't it?
Yeah, he actually did his, we talk about the moderate Palestinian. Yes, his PhD, which he took at the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, was on exactly that, the collusion of Zionists in the Holocaust. Pornographic literature is a good one. We've got to corrupt the people. The destruction of Christianity, Islam, and all other religions of culture, all other religions and cultures, followed by a transitional stage into atheism. And of course, what do they do to back this? Karl Marx. You know, this is the high visibility profile of the Jew. The fact that Karl Marx was the grandson of rabbis on both sides, the fact that he was converted, the fact that he hated his origins. But what did he say? Religion is the opium of the masses. So let's quote the Jew. Let's quote the Jew Karl Marx. We will brainwash people. Through the Rothschilds, we will manipulate the money markets so that there's many economic depressions. So that the people become more and more demoralized. We're going to undermine all the financial systems by foreign loans. We will create national bankruptcy. We destroy the money markets, replacing them with governmental credit institutions. So they're looking at the number of Jews who are prominent capitalists and saying, this is deliberate. We are working together as communists, as capitalists, as press barons. We're going to destroy the world. Training of the king. We will train our future leaders so that we will then finally take over the world. So what it's all about is world takeover. And Trudy, these are the
Go for it, sure.
No, so basically that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with this absolutely bizarre idea that there is a cabal of Jews, the elders of Zion, who come together. They check it every year. But you know, this goes back into medieval times. You know the terrible story of the blood libel. Well, the first blood libel was actually in England in the First English Civil War in 1144. And the church fathers wrote about it. And according to one of the church fathers, there was always a meeting of the Jews. They met in the south of France, because the south of France at that period was quite an open society. It was the borderlands between Islamic Spain and relaxed Christianity. In fact, the Cathars were the main group down there. And these elders meet, these rabbis, they meet, and they decide which country will have the honor of the sacrifice. Every year they have to sacrifice a Christian child. Where does this mishegas come from? In my view, madness, beg your pardon. In my view, this is actual pure theological hatred, the killing of Jesus. And that was more cynical because what happened as a result of the blood libel in Norwich is that the baron was in debt to the Jews, the local baron. The Jews are the money lenders. He wanted to go on crusade. He concocts this with a local bishop. A child disappears in the Jewish quarter. No evidence whatsoever. The mob go on the rampage. They burn the wooden houses, which, what do they house? The wooden chests, which hold the debts.
Yeah.
So everybody wins except the Jews.
Yeah. And I'd like to talk more, perhaps we could do it at the end, about, what's motivating this forgery. And as you say, I think this really does come down to religion, actually, and because it's no accident that it's the world of monotheism that the Jews have been grappling with. But can we now shift in terms of the history and development of the protocols to its journey. You've told us about the origins, but now what happens once it goes out into the mainstream public?
Give me a second. Yes, right. There was a revolution in Russia, wasn't there? A communist revolution. You tell me, was there a disproportionate number of people of Jewish birth in the leadership?
Oh, yeah.
Lev Davidovich Bronstein, better known as Trotsky, led the Red Army. He was Commissar for Foreign Affairs. And don't forget, it was he and his Jewish aide, Yaffe, who signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which brought Germany out of the war. Later on, Yaffe signs the deal with Poland. New states are created. There's an unbelievable horror story at the end of the First World War. Just think about the huge Russian Empire. It covered a sixth of the land surface of the globe. New countries emerged: Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine. There were over 1,000 pogroms. About 100,000 Jews were murdered by the pogromist armies during this period. Jews were seen as communist agitators. Now, the reality, the majority of Jews were never communists, but a disproportionate number of the leadership of communist parties, not just in Russia, but also in Germany. There were 3 revolutions in Munich, which of course was Hitler's city. Each of the leadership were Jewish. Now, what happens is, in the course of the Russian Civil War, a whole corpus of anti-Semitic legends and forgeries build up. For example, the Bolsheviks must have received millions of dollars from rich Jews in America. Now, can you really imagine American billionaires supporting the Bolsheviks? But they're Jews and the revolutionaries are Jews. I will say this until I'm blue in the face. Trotsky did not see himself as a Jew. He saw himself as an internationalist. They wanted to break down all the barriers between peoples. Ironically, I would suggest to you that before the revolution, which was brutalizing, it was actually a utopian dream. Ironically, Trotsky, towards the end of his life, when he's exiled to Mexico, he writes a terribly sad article in which he's looking at the world of the Jews in the late 30s. He said, half the world won't let the Jews in and the other half want to murder them. I wonder what he thought in his darkest hours. So basically, what happens in the Russian Civil War? Trotsky's armies prevail. Who was fighting Trotsky? The whites in Ukraine, Ukrainian nationalists, the same in Lithuania, the same in Latvia, and of course in Poland. It led to a huge upswing in anti-Semitism. Fighting alongside the whites were the Allies. After the defeat of Germany, the British, the French, and the Americans sent troops. As the whites begin to retreat, they have, and many of the British and American soldiers, by the way, and the French, they bring back with them in their knapsacks the protocols of the Elders of Zion, various versions of it, that there's got to be some international conspiracy. The world is very unstable at the end of the First World War. Not only do you have a horrific loss of life, you have this mechanized horror story. Just think about it. People went to war thinking it was going to be glorious and over quickly. In fact, it was one of the bloodiest, most brutal wars. If you want to understand the 20th and 21st centuries, study the First World War, study the mess up that people made at the end of it in the creation of new nation states. We're still suffering from it. Think Ukraine, think Palestine. We are still suffering from the mess that was made at the end of the First World War. People never learn the lessons of history. Now, by 1919, 2 fanatics, Szyberski-Bolk and Winberg, make their way to Munich, because what has happened in Munich is that the 3 revolutions are over. The Freikorps, which is a nationalist German organization, takes power. And these characters find their way to Munich, where they team up with reactionaries in Munich. In fact, in January 1920, the protocols are published under the title The Secrets of the Elders of Zion. And the editor was a man called Zubik. The Nilus book had been originally given to him. Think Sergei Nilus. And a Prussian prince raised money for the dissemination of the protocols in the upper house of the Prussian Diet. Quite a few German aristocrats who are now teaming up with Russian aristocrats. Munich becomes a hotspot. So does Zurich. So does Paris. Think about where the White Russians go. Think about also some of those British soldiers who finish up in Palestine at the end of the First World War, having been to Russia with the protocols in their knapsacks. And there was a professional politician, Count Ernest zu Rentferlo. He was a leading member of the Volkisch Party. He later joined the Nazi Party. He propagated the protocols in his own newspaper, which is called Guardian of the Reich. Now, what's happening in Munich? A little party called the German Workers' Party. A young man called Adolf Hitler, who's working for the Freikorps, remember, that have taken power in Munich. He's actually investigating the parties. He likes it, he joins it, and he becomes part of that terrible, terrible atmosphere in Germany where the Jews are seen as the enemy. He's already a notorious anti-Semite. When he writes Mein Kampf, the protocols figure largely in it. Also, you have a Nazi newspaper, and they begin to circulate the protocols from this period. So the protocols become a very important part of Nazi philosophy.
How significant would you say the protocols was in creating Hitler's worldview? You know, if you had to create a pie chart of all the different influences on Hitler.
I think it's very important. It pulls it all together for him. He already hates Jews. Look, he in Vienna, he had become a bit of a disciple of Karl Lueger, the anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna, who understood populism. And also think Vienna, wonderful, wonderful Vienna, where 10% of the population were Jewish. And again, Jews and modernism, Freud, Mahler, Zweig. Do I need to go on? You see, the high profile of the Jews in the arts, the sciences, whatever.
Yeah. And Mayor Lueger would have read the protocols as well, wouldn't he?
I'm not sure, actually. It's a good question. Not necessarily. He had his own brand of anti-Semitism. But what the protocols do is they neaten it all up. They make it international. You have Viennese anti-Semitism, you have German anti-Semitism, you have Russian anti-Semitism, you have British anti-Semitism. It neatens it all up. And also, it did inspire a man called Alfred Rosenberg, who'd been born, he was a Baltic German. In fact, he gave his first political speech at the House of the Blackheads in Riga, independent Riga, once part of the Russian Empire, on the dangers of Jewish Marxism. He emigrates to Munich and he becomes part of the society, this whole group. And also he's a member of something called the Thule Society. And this is very important because the Thule Society are responsible for the assassination of the German foreign minister as an elder of Zion. Okay, there was a man called Walter Rathenau. He was one of the economic geniuses of Europe. He came from an incredibly wealthy Jewish family. His father created AEJ. He was quite a socialist, though he was also a writer. He had terrible problems with his own Jewishness because when you're dealing with anti-Semitism, if you don't get a lot of comfort from being a Jew, how do you feel about it? You feel very uneasy. He's uneasy about it anyway, but he doesn't convert. He wants to be part of the German world. He loved the Prussian military. He becomes foreign minister in Germany, in that he was a brilliant economist. He signs the Treaty of Rapallo with Marxist Russia. So he's seen this Jew must be an elder of Zion and must be a traitor. And of course, his assassins are members of the Thule Society, very much implicated, and very much implicated in this whole protocols thing. Now, the German Supreme Court, which tries the assassins, this is the judge. The Bible of the Rathenau murderers is the protocols. Behind the Rathenau murder was fanatical anti-Semitism. which found expression in the libelous legend of the Elders of Zion. Okay. Rathenau, by the way, was also very close to Albert Einstein, who watched all this. He couldn't believe what was happening, you know, probably the genius of the 20th century. A friend of Rathenau, he begged Rathenau not to become foreign minister, but he said anti-Semitism is too dangerous. 1922, this happened, when midsummer, as a sacrifice to the Nordic sun god. The other point about these crazy groups, having said that there's Christian origins in Jew hatred, nevertheless, this is secularism. Because Christianity always had restraints. It never said murder all the Jews. What you have now with this new kind of Jew hatred is there is no restraint. The Jew is the enemy. And the protocols is the kind of give out book. Now, it spreads to America. It's printed by a man called Henry Ford, one of the biggest industrialists in the world. Of course, the Ford plants. He was terribly important in America. He had a paper called the Dearborn Independent. He printed the protocols. He believed them.
Do we know how he accessed it originally?
Well, yeah, the man who worked for him, his secretary, I think, first got hold of it. It becomes famous. The protocols are becoming very, very famous. They spread to England. There is the Times newspaper actually write an article on the protocols. Have we escaped a Pax Germanica to fall under the sway of a Pax Judaica? It's printed in it. Give me a second here. Let me find. I'm stopping now because I want to find some. Okay. January 1920, the London Times, they discussed respectfully a German edition of the tract. It's called for an inquiry into what it called an uncanny note of prophecy. The first English language edition, The Jewish Peril, Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. The most widespread English translation is credited to a British correspondent of the Morning Post in Russia called Victor Marsden. So he's picking it all up from Russia. In 1920, 5 editions sold out in England. It's published by Ayr and Spottiswoode, very respectable publishers. However, in 1920-21, it's exposed as a forgery by 2 people. Lucian Wolfe, who was a very talented English journalist, who went into the origins of Jolie and Goethe, which I've already talked about, and also by Philip Graves, who was the uncle of the brilliant Robert Graves, who was the Times correspondent in Turkey. So basically, it was called a literary forgery, and it was written. This is what it appears in the Times. A literary forgery. Our Constantinople correspondent presents for the first time his conclusive proof that the document is a clumsy plagiarism. Okay. So do you want me to actually, I want to read to you before it's exposed what the Times actually said. Will this be useful? Can you slice that in?
Oh, yeah, please.
This is 8th of May 1920, the London Times. What are the protocols? Are they authentic? If so, what malevolent assembly concocted these plans and gloated over the expedition? Are they a forgery? Have we been struggling these tragic years to blow up and extirpate the secret organization of German world dominion? Think World War, only to find beneath it another more dangerous because more secret? Have we been straining every fibre of our being, of our national body, to escape a Pax Germanica, only to fall into a Pax Judaica? The Elders of Zion, as represented in their protocols, are by no means kinder taskmasters than Wilhelm II and his henchmen. Now, Wilhelm II believed in the protocols. When he abdicated, he said, I have been sold out by the Freemasons, the Communists, and the Jews. And he believed in them to his dying day. Now, the Spectator This is October the 16th, 1920, the Spectator magazine. We shall be justified in moving with great caution in our admission of Jews to the fullest rank of citizenship. We must drag the conspirators into the open, tear off their ugly masks, and show the world how ridiculous as well as how evil and dangerous are such pests in society.
Wow. Wow.
So,
for those, by the way, who are for those watching this who aren't in the UK, these are, you know, but today very well-known mainstream established newspapers.
Yeah, and I should tell you, Henry Ford sponsored 500,000 copies.
Wow, wow. So this was
Lord
this
Alfred
really went to his
Douglas.
core.
Lord Alfred Douglas, who was, of course, Oscar Wilde's boyfriend and a huge anti-Semite, he printed them in his paper plain English. He blamed the Jews for the miners' strike. You see, the Jews are responsible for everything you don't want. If you're a capitalist, they're communists. If they're a communist, you're Jews. Look, the 20s was incredibly insecure. Think about the fear of foreigners. Think about how all the countries were imposing restrictions. There was a pandemic. There was economic ruin. You know, ironically, when Rathenau was murdered, that was really what led to the complete collapse of the Deutschmark. Because he was a genius. He was a financial genius. And so you can imagine the Jews have deliberately done this too. So there's no rationality in it at all. So as I said, it's proved to be a forgery. But nevertheless, people went on believing. And even Winston Churchill was gulled for a short while. He wrote an article in the Illustrated Sunday Herald. It's called Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. And he obviously had read the protocols, and he writes this February the 8th, 1920. The conflict between good and evil, which proceeds unceasingly in the breast of man, nowhere reaches such intensity as in the Jewish race. You see, he doesn't call them Jewish citizens of Britain or France. They are the Jewish race. The dual nature of mankind is nowhere more strongly or more terribly exemplified. We owe to the Jews in the Christian revelation a system of ethics, which, even if it was entirely separated from the supernatural, would be incomparably the most precious possession of mankind, worth, in fact, the fruits of all other wisdom. On that system and on that faith, there's been built out the wreck of the Roman Empire, the whole of our existing civilization. And he says it may be that this same astounding race may at the present time be the actual process of producing another system of morals and philosophy as malevolent as Christianity was benevolent, and if not arrested, would shatter the irretrievably all that Christianity has rendered possible. Because the Jews have invented Marxism. They didn't. Karl Marx happened to be a Jew, but so many of the theoreticians of the Communist Party were not Jewish, and it doesn't matter anyway, because none of these Jews, inverted commas, saw themselves as Jewish. You know, there was a fascinating Jewish historian who said that in the end, the number of Jews in the Russian Revolution is going to be so dangerous for world Jewry. We know that many people joined the Nazi Party because they believed all Jews were communists. This is the polarization of politics that always happens when society is under threat. And you see how the Jew is somehow caught in it, just as the Jews are caught in it today, where Israel has become the bête noire of the nation. Israel is now seen as the headquarters of the Elders of Zion by these conspiracy theorists. And of course, so where else do we want
to? I'm thinking we should go now to talking about, well, I mean, we could go to the trials. We could also talk about its journey post-Holocaust. Where would you like to go next?
All right. There have been trials, both in Bern and in South Africa, where Jews felt themselves libeled and the protocols have been put on trial, and they were proved to be a fabrication in court. But it doesn't seem to dent them amongst their followers. Oh, it's a Jewish conspiracy, they say. So even though you've got these trials in the 30s, and what the judge said in Weimar, what the judge said, it's obviously a forgery, but it doesn't matter. And the fact that even in the war, when Hitler was murdering them, he still believed in the protocols. In fact, his last letter from the bunker, he said, we must protect ourselves from the poisoners of all the nations of the world, world Jewry. That's his last letter before he committed suicide. So did he believe it? How do you get into the mind of an Adolf Hitler? Yes, he did believe the Jews were at the root of all the problems.
He must have.
Yeah. He didn't use anti-Semitism as a political ruse. No, they believed it.
To his core, because I mean, wasn't that one of the last things he said? Behind England and America lies the Jews. And they're diverting the tracks to get more soldiers to the Eastern Front instead, sending Hungarian Jews to their deaths. I mean, you got to believe it if you're doing that.
And not only that, don't forget that even when they're losing the war, you can make the case that, and this is what Yehuda Bauer, the great Yehuda Bauer, says, there are two wars: a world war, and the war against the Jews. It's not until the end of April 1944 that Hungarian Jewry is attacked, and men and equipment are diverted within 3 months to the murder of 460,000 people in 3 months, men, women, and children. They built the railway lines right up to the crematorium. What are you dealing with here? Where has this hatred come from? The protocols is, if you like, one of the platforms, but it's much older than that.
Yeah. And can you talk to us about how this has permeated the Arab world? Because, I mean, I even interviewed people. I've interviewed a fascinating guy called Loe Al-Sharif a few months ago. Grew up in Saudi Arabia. He's a few years older than me. And he was raised on a diet of Jew hate. But specifically, he said he had his own copy of the protocols. And we're seeing lots of Israeli soldiers saying they're finding it in Gaza. So talk to us about that.
Okay, I have 3 copies of the protocols. One, I have an original edition. Aren't I lucky? Another was bought on a Black Panther bookstore in New York. And the third was acquired for me by a colleague from a mosque in London. Okay? Now, how did it all start in the Arab world? This level of Jew hatred did not exist in the Arab world prior to the 19th century. Look, there are periods when the Arab world was hostile to the Jews, but you can also say there are periods under Islam that were great periods of Jewish history. The Golden Age of Spain under Islam, the Ottoman Empire under Islam. But what happens in the 19th and early 20th century? The creation of Zionism. Already there is an issue in Islam. Can non-believers rule in Dar el-Islam? And many actually look at the rise of extremist Islam to the colonial incursions in the Middle East, because both Jews and Christians are dhimmis. Now, what does that mean? They're subject peoples. When the great conqueror Omar conquered Jerusalem from the Christians, what was laid down was how Islam deals. The majority of people, pagans, must be converted by the sword. Jews and Christians are the people of the book. They may live in peace under Islam. They can't rule Islam in the world of Islam. And then you have the colonial powers, etc., etc. It really begins to go wrong through characters like Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem. Now's not the time to go too much into his history. Suffice to say, he came from one of the most important families in Jerusalem. His nephew, by the way, was Yasser Arafat. And he had believed originally in Greater Syria, that there would be an empire centered on Damascus. But of course, the British and the French, the colonial powers, it doesn't happen. And his dream was shattered. And that's when he begins to see the fact that the British had issued the Balfour Declaration, promising the Jews a homeland in Palestine, very, very dangerous. And then he is appointed guardian of the Muslim holy places. And he gradually becomes more and more anti-Jewish. He's against any Jewish immigration into Palestine. And you find it in the war years. Actually, he supports Hitler. He goes to Germany and he makes these extraordinarily ghastly speeches. Then, of course, Israel comes into being. And in those years, 45 to 48, the Arabs come together. The Arab world is completely disunited. They come together in hatred of Israel. And if you look at the speeches during the Israeli War of Independence, we will throw the Jews in the sea. The Mediterranean will run with Jewish blood, etc., etc. It was pretty blood-curdling. When does the protocols really rear their ugly head? Well, we have to go to the Russians for that. Stalin was one of the supporters of the State of Israel because he believed at the very best he would have an ally, remember socialist Israel. At that time, most of the Arab countries were feudal monarchies. At the very worst, he'd have a neutral power. But then when Golda Meir came to visit Moscow as the first Israeli ambassador, 50,000 young Jews came out to greet her. What have you got? You've got a problem. Religion was dead in the Soviet Union. And this is when you begin to see the turn. You see trials in Czechoslovakia, where the defendants, most of whom are Jewish, are accused of Titoism, Trotskyism, Zionism, and cosmopolitanism. As there are changes in the Arab world, gradually the old feudal monarchies are replaced in Egypt. The Union of Arab, Egypt and Syria become one nation in 1958, the UAR. The Russians begin to see the Arabs as a potential ally. And out of Russia starts coming this ghastly anti-Semitism, including the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it filters through. Already in the war, you have people like Ibn Saud. He gave the protocols. He gave the protocols to every visiting head of state. So that's how it comes into the Arab world. And now it's totally common currency. It comes originally, it wasn't written in the Arab world. It comes, and now, of course, it's translated into every. Not only that, they have television programs on the protocols. In Egypt, there was a huge popular television program on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Sort of many, many episodes with top Egyptian actors. They believe it. They also believe, if you look at the geography of tiny little Israel, Israel is one of the centers of world conspiracy. Hitler at first was not against Palestine as a Jewish homeland because he believed it would solve his Jewish problem. It's only when he realized that it could become the center of the world Jewish conspiracy, and maybe there should be accommodation with the Arabs, who at that time were, of course, opposed to Zionism. That's when he changed his sides. None of this is rational, Ollie. I'm having to tell you things that, you couldn't have made it up in your worst nightmares. But of course, the Arab world is totally disunited. What do you think? What on earth holds them together? Hatred of Israel.
We're a great uniter.
Yeah, we are. That's the problem. We are the great uniter. And because, as a friend of mine says, we have the restless gene, plus we have this baggage of 2,000 years of worship of the intellect. If we don't succeed, we're insecure. We don't always. Who said what? Who was it who said all the Jews need to do is fail more?
Yeah, Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, maybe we don't fail enough.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also that we gifted the world, ethical monotheism, and basically had this identity. We have this identity as being, charged with this mission of spreading that in the world. And you have two children of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam who are claiming that they now hold that title. And while Judaism was never exclusivist in terms of its views on salvation and all of that, they adopted such an approach, and for the Jews to continue and to thrive despite all the odds against them, and also to be restored to their ancient homeland, is so threatening to a worldview that says, no, God has forsaken the Jews. We are the new emissaries of the divine word. It's so, it's very frustrating.
And
would
not
have
only
thought.
that, and of course you have the modern tools like the internet, which I totally don't understand, which is
Mm,
propagating it. And also we live in a far more isolated world.
mm, mm.
And as a result of that, Jew hatred is just garnering an incredible amount of momentum.
Yeah. Well, that's what I want to talk about to end this discussion, is to talk about, today. How is what is the impact of the protocols today? Because its ripple effects continue, don't they?
Well, they still believe that there is some international sinister Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. If you think about people like Jeremy Corbyn and his notion of the Jewish cabal, do you remember that Maggie Thatcher surrounded herself with a few Jewish advisors? Maybe because she was an outsider and they were an outsider. That was called the Jewish cabal. Later, and if you look at left-wing groups in this country, they always pinpoint the Jew as the enemy. And Jews are therefore, all Jews are Zionists. Zionism is the dirty word. I mean, the fact that the boycott of Israel is absolutely extraordinary. I don't want to go down the road of Israel, right or wrong, but what I want to do is say that Israel has the kind of opprobrium that no other country in the world has. And Israel is a democracy. And a quarter of the population are on the streets protesting against the government. And yet they're boycotting Israeli culture. They're boycotting Israeli investments, inventions. Let them do that at their peril. It makes me very, very angry because the illogicality after the Shoah. You know what Jonathan Sachs said? First they hated our religion, then they hated our race, and now they hate our nation. Israel is now the center of the world Jewish conspiracy. And of course, it's spreading. Whenever there's economic and social unrest, it spreads. And it doesn't matter whether you're an Arabist, an Islamist, whether you are a neo-Nazi or completely left-wing, liberal, the liberal left. It's so violently anti-Semitic. And I'm saying that it is anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And the protocols is their great weapon. They believe it. They believe we have some sort of mystical power. I get so angry. I get angry.
It's funny because
on the blood of my friends who are Holocaust survivors. Do you know what it's doing to them? You have no idea the anger I feel. Or maybe you do, Ollie, but I don't know.
I do.
I have close friends. My closest friend is 99 next week. She has seen real evil. And she believed that if we taught about the Holocaust, we could perhaps prevent it from happening to someone else. What are we seeing, in fact? The Holocaust is being trivialized, it's being de-Judaized, and it's all tied up with the kind of hatred that is promulgated by the protocols of the Elders of Zion. That's what I believe.
Yeah. And I do think that ultimately what this comes down to is the kind of nasty human emotions that, Rabbi Sachs actually said a lot of it is sibling rivalry. It's jealousy, it's envy, and it's an inability to simply, I think, embrace rather than feeling competing and once threatened by the Jewish people and their impacts on the world and their ability to succeed and rise above their challenges. Either a solution could be, well, we fail more, and then you succumb to their envy and all their hateful things, and that's not going to be a solution because, frankly, that just means the Jewish people have to wither away. That can't happen. What has to happen is the rest of the world needs to grow up. They need to embrace the Jewish people and not kind of pander to those darker human emotions. It's time for a maturing that the world needs to have.
They're not going to grow up. I mean, you know what my beef is at the moment. I mean, I am so furious about these student demonstrations. I'm from the river to the sea. I cannot take the lack of education, the fact that nobody seems to understand what they're talking about, the fact that my grandson will have to choose his university on a place where he's going to feel safe, not on the merit of the course. That is, I'm talking to a close friend who had no education after 14 because of the Nazis. And she loves this boy. Do you know what that's doing to her? That's personal. It's personal now.
Yeah.
And I just hope some of our viewers will understand. the powerlessness of the Jew, the hopelessness of the Jew. And today in the West, you have many Jewish families who feel totally insecure. How safe are we in Britain today when you have Corbyn back in Parliament? And the fact that we've got the rise of extremist politics as well.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether it's extreme. Jews thrive in a liberal democracy when there is economic stability. People only start to hate when they haven't got enough food and they feel they're misplaced in the world. But so many people feel totally misplaced today, and we are the perfect scapegoats. Yeah. Doesn't happen, by the way, in Hindu India.
Yeah, true.
But what I mean about where it doesn't happen as well.
Yeah, absolutely, really important point as well. And that's why I say I think so much of it comes back to spiritual and religious envy, sibling rivalry. And I personally feel the point I was making about the world needs to grow up is that, yeah, maybe they won't grow up, in which case we will continue. The point is we've always been on our own, really. At the end of the day, we as a people have always been alone in the world, and we have, and if there is one grain of truth to what the protocol is trying to pick up on, it's the fact that we do have a remarkable story. But it's not because there's a group of Jews meeting together once a year.
In the graveyard in Prague. We must go, Ollie.
Exactly. It's because of who we are as a people. It's because of this incredible destiny that we have, and because of the contribution that we have given to this world. And it's about time that the world grows up, rejects the darker emotions in their psyche and darker ideologies, and we learn to embrace one another. And I recognize that it's doesn't, it might not be the likely scenario, but I think in the end it will have to be inevitable, because we're not going anywhere.
Not everybody hates us. I'm looking for, there have been many, in fact, Churchill in the end said how remarkable we are. I'm looking for a quotation. Can you give me a second?
Sure.
Lloyd George, I took a picture of it because it impressed me so much. I hope I've got it. Oh, yeah. This is Lloyd George in 1925. You may say you have been oppressed and persecuted. That has been your power. You've been hammered into very fine steel, and that is why you have never been broken.
That says it all, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think that's a great quote to end on, actually, because amidst all this, sinister ideas and this book that we've been discussing for the past hour, at the end of the day, Jewish history is a story of hope. And so we have to...
We're still here.
We're still here. And we were talking about this when we were speaking to Howard the other day, that, he said, we got to keep doing it. And you're sometimes thinking, is it having an impact? I think we do. I think we do have to keep telling the truth, telling the story, and being who we are, because
we need
there's
allies.
No escaping it.
But I think what we need is good people from other backgrounds to come up and say, look, this is all a load of rubbish, because we are feeling very alone at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think that is the problem. And also it's affecting some Jews who don't really feel the benefit of being Jewish, and they are adopting a kind of almost Jewish self-hatred. That is also part of the experience of the Jew in the modern world. Yeah.
And that's part of what motivates you and me, and that's what motivates JTV. And we have a wide array of viewers, Jews and non-Jews, who will be watching this and will be taking note. And I do see a lot of comments in our videos from non-Jews offering support, and it does mean a lot to us.
Well, one thing I would stand up. Can I say, Ollie, because if people don't stand up, there's no hope for any of us. And never forget, when the Jews go under, it means something's gone very rotten in society. Because we are kind of the canaries in the mine, but the canaries in the mine always died, and we're not going to die this time.
Yeah, exactly. And the final thing I'd like to say is, for those who are watching this, I know you've expressed a huge amount of interest and enjoyment listening to my interviews with Trudy. We're thinking about other topics to cover, so please do comment with the kind of topics, issues, stories in Jewish history that you'd like us to talk about, because we have ideas, but we'd also like to hear from you. So please do that. I don't know, Trudy, if there's any that you're thinking we should be covering next, because that might start.
I think it's better that it comes from them, not from me.
Fine.
Because
Okay.
I have a
Great.
tunneled vision in certain ways.
Exactly.
Anyway, is that okay,
Fine.
Ollie?
Yeah, that was great. That's great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for watching. We look forward to seeing you for the next interview. Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.